Jake Sullivan was having the worst Tuesday of his life. His truck had broken down again, the third time this month, and the repair bill was going to eat up what little savings he had left. At 34, he felt like he was spinning his wheels, working construction jobs that barely paid the bills and living in a cramped apartment that smelled like the pizza place downstairs. That evening, after another long day swinging a hammer, Jake slumped into his worn-out couch with a beer and opened his laptop. He wasn't really looking for anything specific, just mindlessly scrolling through the internet to forget about his problems for a while. That's when he stumbled across something that caught his attention. There was this government auction website he'd heard about from a buddy at work. Apparently, the state sold off all kinds of weird stuff that people abandoned or couldn't pay taxes on. Cars, boats, office furniture, you name it. Jake had never bothered to look before, but tonight felt different. Maybe he could find a cheap tool or something useful for work. He clicked through pages of random junk. Old computers that probably didn't even turn on, filing cabinets from some defunct business, a bunch of industrial equipment he couldn't even identify. Nothing interesting. He was about to close the laptop when something made him scroll down one more time. Right there, sandwiched between a listing for used office chairs and an old police car, was something that made him do a double take. An entire town, not a house, not a building, but a whole actual town called Clearwater Springs, somewhere up in Montana. The description was short and matter-of-fact, like they were selling a used lawnmower. Instead of 47 acres of land with 12 buildings. Jake read it 3 times to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Apparently, this place had been a mining town back in the day, but when the mine shut down in the 80s, everyone just up and left. The state had taken it over for unpaid taxes, and now they wanted to get rid of it. The starting bid was $50 for a whole town. Jake laughed out loud in his empty apartment. It had to be a joke, right? Or maybe there was some catch he wasn't seeing. Maybe the buildings were falling down, or the land was contaminated, or you had to pay $1 million in back taxes if you won. But as he read through the legal documents, everything seemed legitimate. Sure, the buildings were old and probably needed work, but the land was clean and the title was clear. The auction was set up just like all the others, except instead of bidding on a used desk, you were bidding on an entire piece of American history. Jake found himself clicking through the few photos they'd posted. The main street looked like something out of an old Western movie, with wooden storefronts and a church steeple poking up against the mountains in the background. There was a general store with big windows, a saloon with swinging doors, even what looked like an old schoolhouse. Everything was weathered and worn, but it all seemed to be standing. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Here he was, stuck in a cycle of dead-end jobs and barely scraping by, and suddenly there was this opportunity just sitting there. Maybe he could fix the place up, turn it into some kind of tourist attraction or weekend getaway spot. People paid good money to experience the Old West, right? The more Jake thought about it, the more it made sense. He had the skills to do renovation work, and Lord knows he could use a project that was actually his own instead of making someone else rich. Even if it didn't work out, how much could he really lose? It's not like his current situation was working out so great anyway. As the auction deadline approached, Jake found himself checking the listing obsessively. A few other people had placed small bids, but nothing serious. The price had crept up to $65, which still seemed absurd for an entire town. Jake had $65. Hell, he had $70, though that would mean eating ramen for the rest of the week. On the last day of the auction, Jake sat at his kitchen table staring at his laptop screen. The current bid was $68, and there were only 2 hours left. His finger hovered over the bid button. This was crazy. What did he know about running a town, even an abandoned one? What if there were problems he couldn't see? What if he was just throwing away money he couldn't afford to lose? But then he thought about his broken-down truck, his dead-end job, his apartment that felt more like a prison than a home. What if this was his chance to break out of the cycle? What if this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for without even knowing it? With 15 minutes left in the auction, Jake took a deep breath and placed his bid. $70 for the town of Clearwater Springs, Montana. He felt his heart pounding as he hit the submit button, then spent the next 14 minutes refreshing the page every few seconds, waiting for someone to outbid him. When the auction ended and he was declared the winner, Jake just sat there staring at the screen in disbelief. He owned a town, an actual, real-life ghost town in the mountains of Montana. For the price of a decent dinner for two, he had just become the owner of 47 acres and 12 buildings. The paperwork took about 3 weeks to process, and during that time, Jake found himself researching everything he could about Clearwater Springs. He learned that it had been founded in 1887 when gold was discovered in the nearby mountains. For about 90 years, it had been a thriving community with hundreds of residents, a school, churches, and several businesses. But when the mine finally played out and the last company pulled up stakes, the town died almost overnight. People just walked away from their lives there, leaving behind houses full of furniture, stores full of merchandise, even cars in some cases. Nature had slowly been reclaiming the place, but according to the county records, the buildings were still structurally sound. Someone had been checking on the property periodically to make sure it wasn't becoming a safety hazard. As Jake drove his newly repaired truck north toward Montana to see his purchase for the first time, he felt a mixture of excitement and terror. This was either going to be the smartest thing he'd ever done or the dumbest, but either way it was his. For better or worse, Jake Sullivan was now the proud owner of a genuine American ghost town. The GPS led him off the interstate, then off the state highway, then onto increasingly smaller roads until he was driving on what was barely more than a dirt track winding through pine forests and around the bases of mountains. When he finally crested a hill and saw the valley spread out below him, with the wooden buildings of Clearwater Springs clustered along what had once been its main street, Jake pulled over and just sat there for a minute, trying to process what he was looking at. It was real. It was actually real. And now it was his. Jake sat in his truck for what felt like forever, just staring down at the valley. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows between the buildings, and the whole scene looked like a movie set that someone had just walked away from. He could see the main street running straight through the middle of town, with wooden buildings lined up on both sides, like they were waiting for cowboys to come riding through. The silence was the first thing that hit him when he finally got out of the truck. Not just quiet, but that deep kind of silence you only get in places where nobody has lived for a long time. No traffic, no air conditioners humming, no neighbors talking over fences. Just the wind moving through the pine trees and the distant sound of water running somewhere nearby. Jake grabbed his backpack and started walking down the hill toward town. The dirt road was rutted from old tire tracks, but weeds were growing up through the middle of it. As he got closer to the buildings, he could see more details. The paint was peeling off most of the wooden structures, and some of the roofs looked like they'd seen better days, but everything was still standing. That was more than he'd expected for buildings that had been empty for 40 years. The first building he came to was the old general store. The wooden sign hanging over the front door was so faded he could barely make out the letters, but he could see it had once said Morrison's Dry Goods. The front windows were dusty but not broken, and when Jake peered through them, he could actually see shelves still lined up inside, like the owners had just stepped out for lunch and never came back. Walking down the main street felt like traveling back in time. There was the saloon with its classic swinging doors, though one of them was hanging crooked on its hinges. Next to that was a building that might have been a hotel, with a covered porch running along the front. At the end of the street he could see the white steeple of a small church poking up above the other buildings. Jake was so busy looking at everything that it took him a while to notice something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There were fresh tire marks in the dirt. Not old ones that had been there for months, but new ones that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Someone had been driving through his town recently. At first, he figured it must have been the county inspector or maybe someone from the auction company doing a final check on the property. But as he looked more carefully, he started noticing other things that didn't fit with a place that was supposed to be completely abandoned. There was a path worn through the weeds, leading from the main street toward one of the houses at the far end of town. Some of the windows on that house looked cleaner than the others, like someone had been washing them. And now that he was paying attention, Jake could swear he smelled something cooking in the air. Not strongly, but just a hint of wood smoke and maybe something like beans or stew. Jake's heart started beating faster. The paperwork had been clear that the property was vacant, and the state wouldn't have sold it to him if there were still people living there, right? But the evidence was right in front of his eyes. Someone was definitely here, or at least had been here very recently. He followed the worn path through the tall grass, moving as quietly as he could. The house at the end was smaller than some of the others, but it looked like it was in the best shape. The roof appeared solid, and someone had clearly been taking care of the place. There were even a few vegetables growing in what looked like a small garden behind the house. As Jake got closer, he could definitely smell food cooking, and he could see thin wisps of smoke rising from the chimney. His mind was racing. What was he supposed to do here? This was his property now, legally bought and paid for. But if there were people living here who didn't know it had been sold, that was a whole different situation. He was about 50 feet from the front door when he heard something that made his blood run cold. Children's voices, laughing and playing somewhere behind the house. Jake stopped walking and just listened. There was definitely more than one kid back there, and they sounded young. Now he really didn't know what to do. It was one thing to find some squatter who might have been camping out in an abandoned building, but a family with children? That changed everything. These people had obviously been living here for a while, fixing the place up, making it into a home. How do you tell? A family with kids that they have to leave because you bought their house at an auction for $70? Jake stood there in the tall grass, hidden behind an old shed, trying to figure out his next move. Part of him wanted to just get back in his truck and drive away, pretend he'd never seen any of this. Maybe he could call the county and let them deal with it. But another part of him knew that wasn't right either. These people deserved to know what was happening, and they deserved to hear it from him directly, not from some government official showing up with eviction papers. Before he could lose his nerve, Jake walked up to the front door and knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet afternoon, and immediately he heard movement inside the house. Footsteps, hushed voices, the sound of someone peering out a window. After what felt like forever, the door opened just a crack, and Jake found himself looking at a woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked tired but alert, and there was something in her eyes that told him she'd been through some hard times. Behind her, he could just make out the shapes of children trying to see who was at the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, and Jake could hear the tension in her voice. This was clearly not a place that got many unexpected visitors. "I'm really sorry to bother you," Jake said, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. Jake could see the woman's grip tighten on the door handle as she waited for him to explain why he was standing on her front porch. Behind her, he caught glimpses of 3 children peering around corners and doorways, their curious eyes taking in this unexpected stranger who had appeared in their quiet world. "My name is Jake Sullivan," he said, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "I know this is going to sound really strange, but I think there's been some kind of mix-up. I bought this town at a government auction 3 weeks ago, and they told me it was completely empty." The woman's face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, and then something that looked like panic. She stepped back slightly, and Jake could see her mind racing as she tried to process what he'd just told her. "You bought the town?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean you bought the town?" "The whole thing," Jake said, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. 47 acres, all the buildings. The state was selling it for unpaid taxes. I had no idea anyone was living here. I swear if I had known. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, Jake could see tears starting to form. She took a deep breath and seemed to gather herself together. "I'm Rosa Hernandez," she said, opening the door wider. "These are my children. Anna is 16, Carlos is 12, and little Lucia is 7. Each child gave a small wave as their mother introduced them, though they all looked worried about what this conversation meant for their family. We'd been living here for almost 2 years, Rosa continued. After my husband died, I couldn't afford rent anywhere else, and we found this place. I know we don't have any legal right to be here, but the children needed a home, and nobody seemed to care about this old town anymore. Jake felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Here was a widow with 3 kids who had been making the best of an impossible situation, and now he was the guy who had unknowingly bought their home out from under them. Your husband died? He asked gently. Rosa nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Construction accident 2.5 years ago. There were medical bills, and then I couldn't work because someone needed to take care of him during his last months. By the time everything was settled, we'd lost our apartment. Lost everything, really. I was doing some bookkeeping work online, just enough to buy food and gas, but not enough for a security deposit on a new place. She gestured toward the town around them. Then Carlos found this place on one of our drives. We were basically living in our car at that point, just driving around looking for somewhere safe to sleep. When we saw all these empty buildings, it felt like a miracle. A whole town that nobody wanted anymore. Jake looked at the children, who were now gathered around their mother like they were preparing for bad news. Anna, the oldest, had protective arm around her little sister's shoulders. Carlos was trying to look brave, but Jake could see the fear in his eyes. These kids had already lost their father and their home once. Now it was happening again? So you've been fixing this place up? Jake asked, trying to buy himself time to figure out what to say next. We've done what we could, Rosa said, a note of pride creeping into her voice despite the circumstances. The roof was leaking when we got here, so I learned how to patch it from YouTube videos. Carlos figured out how to get the old wood stove working so we could heat the house and cook. Ana turned the old schoolhouse into a place where she could do her art and where I could teach the younger ones. Jake looked around with new eyes. What he had initially seen as a family squatting in an abandoned building was actually something much more impressive. These people had taken a forgotten piece of history and brought it back to life through sheer determination and hard work. We grow most of our own vegetables now, Carlos chimed in, clearly wanting to show that they weren't just taking advantage of the situation. And I've been fixing up some of the other buildings too. The church had some broken windows, but I found replacement glass in the old hardware store and figured out how to install it. You've been going to school here? Jake asked Ana. Mom homeschools us, she replied. I help teach Carlos and Lucia. We use the internet when we can get a signal, and Mom drives us to the library in town once a week to use their computers and check out books. Jake was starting to understand the full scope of what this family had accomplished. They hadn't just found shelter in an abandoned town, they had created a functioning home and community out of nothing. They were raising children, maintaining buildings, growing food, and getting an education, all while completely off the grid. The state really sold this place? Rosa asked, and Jake could hear the desperation creeping back into her voice. Are we going to have to leave? That was the question Jake had been dreading. Legally, he owned this property now. He had every right to ask them to leave, and they had no legal right to stay. But looking at this family, seeing what they had built here and knowing their story, the idea of forcing them out made him feel sick. How did you even survive the winters here? He asked, still trying to process everything. The first winter was rough, Rosa admitted, but the house is solid and we had the wood stove. Carlos and I spent most of the fall chopping firewood and sealing up cracks. Ana made curtains and quilts from fabric we found in some of the old houses. We made it work. Little Lucia, who had been quiet through most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. Are you going to make us leave? She asked. In a small voice that nearly broke Jake's heart, Jake knelt down so he was at eye level with the 7-year-old. I don't know yet, sweetheart, he said honestly. I need to think about this. But I promise you, whatever happens, we're going to figure it out together, okay? Rosa was watching this interaction carefully, and Jake could see her trying to read his intentions. She was probably used to people making promises they didn't keep, especially after everything her family had been through. "Look," Jake said, standing back up and addressing the whole family, "I'm not going anywhere today, and neither are you. I need some time to think about all this, and you probably need time to figure out what your options are. Can we talk again? Tomorrow? You're staying in town tonight?" Rosa asked, surprised. "I brought camping gear," Jake said. "I was planning to stay a few days anyway, just to look around and see what I'd gotten myself into. Though I have to say, this isn't exactly what I was expecting to find." For the first time since he'd knocked on the door, Rosa smiled just a little. "I bet it wasn't," she said. Jake set up his tent in what used to be the town square, right between the old saloon and the general store. As darkness fell over Clearwater Springs, he found himself sitting by a small campfire, staring at the warm glow coming from the windows of Rosa's house at the end of the street. He could hear faint sounds of family life drifting through the evening air, the clatter of dishes being washed, children's laughter, and Rosa's voice reading a bedtime story to little Lucia. This wasn't how he'd imagined his first night as a town owner would go. He'd pictured himself exploring empty buildings, maybe camping in the old saloon, dreaming about all the possibilities for fixing the place up. Instead, he was wrestling with a situation that felt like it had no good answers. Jake pulled out his phone and tried calling his buddy Tommy, the one who'd told him about the auction website in the first place. But there was no signal this far. Out in the mountains. He was completely on his own with this decision, which somehow made it feel even heavier. The legal side was crystal clear. He'd bought the property fair and square, following all the proper procedures. The state had declared it abandoned and put it up for auction. Rosa and her family were technically trespassing, no matter how sympathetic their situation was. Any lawyer would tell him he had every right to ask them to leave immediately, but the human side was a lot more complicated. This wasn't some random squatter who'd moved in last week. Rosa and her children had been living here for nearly 2 years, pouring their hearts and what little money they had into making this ghost town livable again. They'd turned it from a collection of rotting buildings into something that actually felt like a community. Jake got up and walked around the town square, looking at everything with new eyes. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see evidence of the family's hard work everywhere. The wooden sidewalks had been swept clean. Someone had replaced several broken boards on the porch of the general store. The church at the end of the street had new glass in the windows that Carlos had mentioned installing. He wandered over to the old schoolhouse that Ana had supposedly turned into an art studio. Through the window, he could see easels set up with paintings in various stages of completion. There were landscapes of the surrounding mountains, portraits of her family, and what looked like historical scenes of the town during its mining days. The girl had real talent, and she'd found a way to honor the history of this place while making it her own. Behind the schoolhouse, Jake discovered something that really stopped him in his tracks. Rosa had created a garden that was easily twice the size of his apartment back in Denver. Neat rows of vegetables stretched out in carefully planned patterns, with a makeshift greenhouse constructed from old windows and salvaged lumber. This wasn't just someone trying to get by, this was someone planning for the future. Someone who believed in this place enough to invest in it long-term. As Jake walked back toward his campfire, he passed the house where the family was settling in for the night. Through the kitchen window, he could see Rosa sitting at a table with a laptop, working by the light of an oil lamp. She was probably doing the bookkeeping work she'd mentioned, trying to scrape together enough money to keep her family fed. The image of her hunched over that computer, working late into the night while her children slept safely nearby, made Jake's chest tight with emotion. He tried to imagine what would happen if he insisted they leave. Where would they go? Rosa had already told him they couldn't afford a security deposit on an apartment, and that was 2 years ago. Their situation probably hadn't improved much since then. The kids would have to leave the only stable home they'd known since their father died. Ana would lose her art studio, Carlos would have to abandon the building projects he was clearly passionate about, and little Lucia would be uprooted from the only place she really remembered living. But Jake also had to think about his own situation. He'd spent his last $70 on this town, betting everything on the hope that he could turn it into something profitable. He couldn't afford to just walk away from the investment, even if it was a small one. This was supposed to be his chance to finally build something of his own, to break out of the cycle of working other people's construction jobs and living paycheck to paycheck. Then again, what exactly was his plan? He'd had some vague ideas about maybe turning the place into a tourist attraction or a weekend getaway spot, but he hadn't really thought it through. He didn't have the money for major renovations, and he certainly didn't have the business experience to run a tourist operation. Rosa and her family had already proven they could make this place work as a home. Maybe they understood something about Clearwater Springs that he didn't. As the fire died down and the night got colder, Jake found himself thinking about his own childhood. His parents had divorced when he was 8, and he'd spent the next 10 years bouncing between their houses, never really feeling like he belonged anywhere. He remembered what it felt like to have your whole world turned upside down by adult decisions you had no control over. The thought of putting Rosa's children through that same kind of upheaval made him feel sick, but there was another part of him that felt angry about the whole situation. Why hadn't the state done a proper inspection before putting the property up for auction? Why hadn't anyone bothered to check if people were actually living there? And why did he have to be the one to deal with this mess? He'd followed all the rules, done everything legally, and now he was the bad guy. Just because he'd won an auction that never should have happened in the first place. Jake stayed up most of the night, feeding the fire and turning the problem over in his mind from every possible angle. He thought about calling the county in the morning and explaining the situation, but what would that accomplish? They'd probably just send someone out to evict Rosa and her family, and Jake would still be stuck with a ghost town he couldn't afford to develop. He thought about asking Rosa to pay rent, but she'd already made it clear that money was tight. Besides, what would be fair rent for a house in a town that didn't officially exist? And how could he justify charging a widow with 3 kids for a place she'd already put so much work into improving? As the sun started to rise over the mountains, Jake realized he'd been approaching this all wrong. Instead of thinking about Rosa and her family as a problem to be solved, maybe he should be thinking about them as an opportunity. They clearly knew how to make this place work, and they cared about it in a way that went beyond just having a roof over their heads. But was he really considering going into business with people he'd just met? People who were technically trespassing on his property? It sounded crazy when he put it like that. Then again, buying a ghost town for $70 had sounded pretty crazy too, and he'd done that without hesitation. Jake put out the fire and walked over to Rosa's house, where he could smell coffee brewing and hear the family starting their day. Whatever he decided, they deserved to know as soon as possible. Keeping them in suspense wasn't fair to anyone, especially the children. Jake knocked on Rosa's door just as the morning sun was painting the mountains gold behind the town. He could hear the family moving around inside, and the smell of bacon cooking made his stomach growl. He'd been living on granola bars and instant coffee since he'd arrived, and the thought of a real breakfast was almost as appealing as the conversation he was about to have. Rosa opened the door, looking surprised to see him so early. She was already dressed and had her hair pulled back, ready for the day, but Jake could see the worry lines around her eyes. She'd probably slept about as well as he had. "Morning," Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I know. It's early, but I've been thinking all night about our situation. Could we talk?" "Of course," Rosa said, stepping aside to let him in. "The kids are having breakfast. Would you like some coffee?" The inside of the house was nothing like what Jake had expected from an abandoned building. Rosa had somehow transformed the old structure into a warm, welcoming home. The walls were painted in soft colors, and handmade curtains hung in the windows. There was a comfortable mix of salvaged furniture and things that were clearly family pieces they'd managed to save from their old life. Ana, Carlos, and Lucia were sitting around a wooden table that looked like it had been rescued from one of the other buildings and carefully restored. They all looked up when Jake walked in, and he could see the anxiety in their faces. They knew this conversation was going to determine their future. "Kids, why don't you finish eating and then go get Started on your schoolwork? Rosa said gently. Mr. Sullivan and I need to talk about some grown-up things. Are we going to have to move again? Lucia asked in a small voice, and Jake felt his heart break a little. We're going to figure everything out, Jake said, kneeling down next to her chair. I promise you that whatever happens, your mom and I are going to make sure you're okay. After. The children reluctantly left the kitchen. Rosa poured Jake a cup of coffee and sat down across from him at the table. Her hands were wrapped around her own mug like she was trying to warm herself, even though the room wasn't cold. I want you to know, she said, before Jake could speak, that we never meant to take advantage of anyone. When we found this place, it seemed like nobody cared about it anymore. We've tried to take good care of everything, to make improvements instead of just using it up. I can see that, Jake said. I spent half the night walking around town looking at all the work you've done. It's incredible, really. You've brought this place back to life. Rosa looked surprised by the compliment. It's not much, but we've done what we could with what we had. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, Jake said, taking a deep breath. I've been thinking about this situation from every angle, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. You know this place better than anyone? You understand what it needs, what works, what doesn't. You've already proven you can make it livable. I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at, Rosa said, though Jake could see a tiny spark of hope in her eyes. What if instead of me asking you to leave, we worked together? Jake said, the words coming out in a rush. What if we became partners in fixing this place up? Rosa stared at him for a long moment like she was trying to figure out if he was serious. Partners? What do you mean? Jake leaned forward, getting excited as the idea took shape in his mind. Look, I bought this town because I thought maybe I could turn it into something profitable. A tourist attraction, maybe, or a retreat center. But I don't really know anything about running that kind of business. I'm just a construction worker who got lucky at an auction. And I'm just a widow with 3 kids who's been squatting in your town for 2 years, Rosa said quietly. No, you're not, Jake said firmly. You're someone who took a dying place and made it live again. You're someone who figured out how to grow food in the middle of nowhere, how to educate 3 kids without a school, how to make a community out of nothing. Those are exactly the skills this place needs. Rosa was quiet for a moment, and Jake could practically see her mind working through the possibilities and problems. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that you and your family stay here, officially and legally, Jake said. In exchange, you help me figure out how to develop this place properly. You handle the business side, the bookkeeping, the planning, dealing with permits and regulations. I'll handle the construction and renovation work. We split whatever profits we eventually make. You want to go into business with someone you met yesterday? Rosa asked, and Jake could hear the disbelief in her voice. I want to go into business with someone who's already proven they can make this work, Jake corrected. Besides, buying a ghost town from someone I've never met wasn't exactly the most conventional business decision either. Rosa got up and walked to the window, looking out at the town she'd called home for 2 years. What about the legal aspects? I don't have any money to invest in this. I can't exactly buy in as an equal partner. You've already invested 2 years of your life and all the improvements you've made, Jake said. As far as I'm concerned, that's worth more than the $70 I paid for this place. And if it doesn't work out, if we can't make it profitable? Jake shrugged. Then we'll be in the same situation we're in right now, except you won't have to worry about me kicking you out. Look, I'm not promising this will be easy, or that we'll get rich, or that we'll even succeed. But I think we've got a better chance working together than either of us has trying to figure this out alone. Rosa turned back from the window, and Jake could see she was seriously considering it. The children would be okay with this arrangement? Living here permanently? From what I can see, the children are already okay with living here, Jake said. This is their home. I'm just offering to make it official. And you'd be okay with living here too? This isn't exactly the suburbs. Jake looked around the cozy kitchen, then out the window at the mountains surrounding their little valley. I've been living in a cramped apartment above a pizza place for the last 3 years. This looks like paradise to me. Rosa sat back down at the table, and Jake could see she was wrestling with the decision. "This is crazy," she said finally. "Completely crazy," Jake agreed. "But maybe that's exactly what this place needs." Conventional thinking would have left Clearwater Springs to rot. You've already proven that sometimes crazy ideas work. What would the partnership look like legally? How would we structure it? I honestly don't know, Jake admitted. We'd have to figure that out as we go. Maybe we could set up some kind of joint ownership arrangement or a business partnership. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure there are ways to make it work legally. Rosa was quiet for several minutes, staring into her coffee cup. Jake could hear the children's voices from the other room, where they were presumably working on their school lessons. Finally, she looked up at him. "You're really serious about this? You'd give up half ownership of your town to people you just met? I'd rather own half of something that actually works than all of something that doesn't," Jake said. "And I have a feeling that with your family here, this place could really be something special." Rosa stood up and extended her hand across the table. "Okay, Jake Sullivan. Let's see if we can bring a ghost town back to life." Jake shook her hand, and for the first time since he'd driven into Clearwater Springs, he felt like everything was going to work out exactly the way it was supposed to. The first month of their partnership was a whirlwind of activity that transformed Clearwater Springs in ways Jake never could have imagined. He'd started driving up from Denver every Friday evening, spending his weekends working alongside Rosa and her family to slowly bring the ghost town back to life. What had begun as a simple handshake agreement was turning into something that felt more like building a community from scratch. Jake quickly discovered that each member of the Hernandez family brought unique skills to their restoration project. Rosa turned out to be incredibly organized and practical, creating detailed lists of what needed to be done, researching building codes and permits, and somehow managing to stretch their tiny budget to cover materials they desperately needed. She'd found a local hardware store owner who was willing to give them a discount on supplies in exchange for Rosa doing his bookkeeping, and she'd negotiated with contractors to get advice in return for helping with their paperwork. Aina, the 16-year-old, had an artist's eye for color and design that proved invaluable when they were trying to figure out how to restore the buildings while keeping their historical character. She'd spent hours researching what the town would have looked like in its heyday, using old photographs she'd found in the library and online archives. When they repainted the general store, it was Aina who suggested the deep green color that made the building look like it belonged in an old Western movie. Carlos had turned into Jake's right-hand man when it came to the actual construction work. The 12-year-old had a natural understanding of how things worked and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He'd already taught himself basic plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos, and Jake was amazed by how quickly the kid picked up new skills. Together, they'd managed to get running water restored to 3 of the buildings, and were working on installing a small solar power system that would give them electricity without having to run power lines all the way out to their remote location. Even little Lucia found ways to contribute that surprised everyone. She had appointed herself the official paint mixer and tool organizer, and Jake had learned not to underestimate her ability to remember exactly where every screwdriver and paintbrush belonged. She also had a talent for finding useful items in the abandoned buildings that the adults had overlooked. It was Lucia who discovered a box of vintage light fixtures in perfect condition, hidden in the back room of the old hotel. By the end of October, they had made remarkable progress. The general store now had a new roof and fresh paint, and Rosa had started using it as headquarters for their operation. She'd set up her computer and bookkeeping supplies on the old wooden counter, and the family used the back room for storage. The saloon had been cleaned out and was being converted into a workshop where Jake could do carpentry projects and Carlos could tinker with mechanical repairs. The church had become Aina's art studio and the family's evening gathering place. She'd hung her paintings on the walls, and Rosa had moved an old piano they'd found in one of the houses to the front of the church. In the evenings, they'd all gather there to plan the next day's work or just to relax and enjoy each other's company. But their biggest success was the old hotel building. Jake and Carlos had spent weeks making it structurally sound, and Rosa had researched what permits they'd need to eventually operate it as a bed and breakfast. Aina had designed a color scheme that made the rooms feel welcoming while still maintaining their historical atmosphere. They'd managed to get 4 guest rooms ready for visitors, complete with handmade quilts that Rosa had sewn during the long winter evenings. Word of their project had started to spread in the surrounding communities. The story of the man who bought a ghost town and found a family living there had made its way into local newspapers and social media. People were curious about what they were doing with Clearwater Springs, and some had started making the drive out just to see the place for themselves. Their first official visitor had been Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman from the nearest town who remembered Clearwater Springs from her childhood. She'd brought photo albums full of pictures from the town's mining days and had spent an entire afternoon telling stories about the families who used to live there. Aina had taken careful notes and had started incorporating these stories into a historical display she was creating for the general store. That visit had given Rosa an idea. What if we started offering tours? She'd suggested one evening as they sat around the wood stove in the church. People are already driving out here, just to look around. We could charge a small fee and use the money to fund more restoration work. Jake had been hesitant at first. Are we really ready for that? I mean, we've got running water in 3 buildings and electricity in 2. That's not exactly resort-level amenities. But that's exactly what makes it special, Aina had pointed out. People don't want resort amenities when they come to a ghost town. They want to experience what it was really like to live here. Carlos had gotten excited about the idea immediately. We could show them how the mining equipment worked, and I could demonstrate the water wheel system I've been restoring behind the mill. Even Lucia had suggestions. I could show them my rock collection and tell them about all the animals that live here now. Rosa had started researching what they'd need to do legally to offer tours, and within 2 weeks they'd gotten their first group booking. A historical society from a nearby city wanted to bring 20 people out for a Saturday afternoon visit. That first tour had been a nerve-wracking success. Jake had led the group around the town, explaining the restoration work they were doing and the history of the buildings. Rosa had told the story of how they'd ended up there and what their vision was for the future. Aina had shown off her historical display and her paintings, while Carlos demonstrated how he'd gotten the old mill wheel turning again. Lucia had charmed everyone by leading them on a nature walk and pointing out where different animals had made their homes in and around the buildings. The visitors had been fascinated by the combination of history and ongoing restoration work. Several had asked about staying overnight, and one woman had inquired about booking the church for a small wedding ceremony. By the time the group left, Rosa and Jake were looking at each other with a mixture of excitement and amazement. I think, we might actually be onto something here, Rosa had said as they watched the last car disappear down the mountain road. Either that, or we're all completely crazy, Jake had replied, but he was grinning as he said it. The success of their first tour had led to more bookings, and by December they were hosting visitors almost every weekend. Rosa had created a simple website and social media accounts that showcased their progress and told their story. The income from tours wasn't huge, but it was enough to buy materials for their next round of improvements and to start paying Jake back for some of his initial investments. More importantly, the visitors had started to feel like part of an extended community. People would come back to see their progress, and some had even started volunteering their time to help with specific projects. A retired carpenter had spent a weekend teaching Carlos advanced woodworking techniques. A local teacher had donated boxes of books for Aina's informal school program. A group of hikers had helped them clear trails that would make it easier for future visitors to explore the area around the town. As Jake drove back to Denver on a snowy Sunday evening in December, he found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just a few months. He was still working construction during the week, but now he had something to look forward to on weekends that felt like more than just work. He was building something that mattered with people who had become more like family than business partners. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, Jake's world got turned upside down by a phone call he never saw coming. It was a cold February morning, and he was in the middle of fixing a broken water pipe in the general store when his phone rang. The name on the screen made his stomach drop immediately. "Hello, Jake," said a voice he hadn't heard in over a year. "It's Nicole. We need to talk." Nicole had been Jake's girlfriend for 3 years, and their relationship had ended badly when she decided to move to California to start her own marketing business. She'd wanted Jake to come with her, to invest his savings in her company and help her build something big. When Jake had refused, saying he wasn't ready to leave Denver and risk everything on a business he didn't understand, she'd called him unambitious and small-minded. The breakup had been bitter and final, or so Jake had thought. "What do you want, Nicole?" Jake asked, stepping outside into the cold mountain air where Rosa and the kids couldn't hear the conversation. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about you," Nicole said, and Jake could hear the smile in her voice. "Something about you buying a whole town and turning it into some kind of tourist attraction? That doesn't sound like the Jake remember, the one who was too scared to take any real risks." Jake felt his jaw clench. Things change. People change. "Apparently they do," Nicole continued, "which is why I'm calling. My business is doing really well out here, but I'm looking to expand into experiential tourism. Authentic historical experiences are huge right now, and what you've got sounds like exactly the kind of property I could turn into something really profitable." "It's not for sale," Jake said immediately. "Everything's for sale for the right price," Nicole replied. "Besides, you owe me. I had plans for us for the business we were going to build together. When you backed out, it cost me opportunities. Now I'm offering you a chance to make that right." After Nicole hung up, promising to drive out to see the property whether Jake invited her or not, Jake sat on the steps of the general store feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. He'd worked so hard to build something good here, something that mattered to real people. The thought of Nicole swooping in and trying to turn it into some slick commercial operation made him sick, but the conversation had planted seeds of doubt. In his mind, was he being naive about what they were doing here? Nicole had always been better with money and business than he was. Maybe she was right that they could be making a lot more profit from Clearwater Springs. Maybe he was holding everyone back by not thinking bigger. When Rosa found him sitting there 20 minutes later, still staring at his phone, she immediately knew something was wrong. "Bad news?" she asked, sitting down next to him on the wooden steps. "My ex-girlfriend wants to buy the town," Jake said bluntly. "She thinks she can turn it into some kind of big commercial operation." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "And what do you think?" "I think she's probably right that she could make more money from it than we are," Jake admitted. "Nicole's good at business. She knows how to market things, how to scale them up. We're just making it up as we go along." "But that's not what I asked," Rosa said gently. "I asked what you think about selling to her." Jake looked around at the town they'd spent months restoring, at the house where Rosa's children were probably working on their school lessons, at the church where they'd spent so many evenings planning their future. "I think it would destroy everything we've built here." "Then why do you look like you're considering it?" Before Jake could answer, Carlos came running out of the church, his face flushed with excitement. "Jake! Rosa! Come quick!" "There's a county inspector here, and he says some of our buildings are unsafe." The inspector turned out to be a thin, nervous man named Mr. Davis, who looked completely out of place in his clean suit and shiny shoes. He'd driven up from the county seat with a clipboard full of forms and a serious expression that immediately put everyone on edge. "I've received complaints about unpermitted construction and potential safety violations," he announced, not even bothering with introductions. "I need to inspect every building you've been working on." "Complaints from who?" Rosa asked, but Mr. Davis just shrugged and started walking toward the general store. The inspection was a disaster. Mr. Davis found problems with everything they'd done, even work that Jake was certain met building codes. The electrical system Carlos had installed was declared unsafe because it hadn't been done by a licensed electrician. The plumbing Jake had repaired was supposedly not up to current standards. Even the paint Aina had carefully applied was somehow in violation of historical preservation guidelines that Jake had never heard of. "You'll need to bring everything up to code within 60 days, Mr. Davis said as he handed Rosa a list that was 3 pages long. "If you don't, we'll have to condemn the buildings and shut down your operation." After he left, the family gathered in the church to look over the list of required repairs. The cost estimate made Jake's stomach sink. They'd need licensed contractors for the electrical and plumbing work, which would cost thousands of dollars they didn't have. They'd need new permits for almost everything they'd already done, which meant more fees and probably months of delays. How much would all this cost? Aina asked quietly. Rosa had been doing calculations on her laptop. "At least $15,000, maybe more. And that's if we can find contractors willing to drive all the way out here." "We don't have $15,000, Carlos said, stating the obvious. "No, we don't," Jake agreed. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about Nicole's phone call. "But I know someone who does." Rosa looked at him sharply. "Your ex-girlfriend. She'd probably pay enough to cover all the repairs and still leave us with some profit," Jake said, hating himself for even considering it. "Maybe we should at least hear what she has to offer." "And then what?" Aina asked. "We'd have to leave again." "Not necessarily," Jake said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Maybe she'd keep you on as employees or something." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Rosa stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the town square. "You know," she said, without turning around, "when we first came here, we were running away from everything we'd lost. Our home, our stability, our future. We found this place and we made it ours through hard work and love. We didn't have much money then either, but we found a way." She turned back to face Jake. "If you want to sell to your ex-girlfriend, that's your choice. It's your property, legally speaking. But don't do it because you think it's what's best for us. We've survived worse than a county inspector with a clipboard. But what if they shut us down?" Jake asked. "What if we can't get the permits and they condemn the buildings? Then we'll figure something else out," Rosa said firmly. "But we'll do it together, as a family. Because that's what we are now, whether we're business partners or not." Carlos. And Aina nodded in agreement, and even little Lucia, who'd been quietly listening to the grown-up conversation, spoke up. "I don't want to live somewhere else," she said simply. "This is our home." Jake looked around at the 4 people who had become the most important part of his life, sitting in the church they'd restored together, surrounded by the town they'd brought back to life through sheer determination. Nicole might be able to offer them financial security, but she couldn't offer them this sense of belonging, this feeling of building something meaningful together. "Okay," he said finally. "We'll find another way. We'll fight the county, find the money somehow, do whatever it takes. But we're not selling. This is our home." The relief on Rosa's face was immediate, and Jake realized that she'd been just as scared as he was about losing what they'd built together, but there was still the matter of $15,000 in 60 days to make it happen. The solution came from the most unexpected place imaginable. 3 days after the devastating county inspection, Jake was sitting in the church with Rosa, both of them staring at laptops and trying to figure out how to raise $15,000 in less than 2 months. Aina was sketching in the corner, Carlos was tinkering with an old radio he'd found, and Lucia was playing with a wooden toy train that Jake had carved for her. That's when Aina suddenly looked up from her drawing pad with an expression Jake had never seen before, part excitement, part disbelief. "What if we crowdfunded it?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Rosa asked, looking up from the loan applications she'd been filling out online. Aina stood up and walked over to them, her sketchpad in hand. "I've been following this artist online who needed money to finish a mural project. She put up a campaign on one of those crowdfunding websites and raised $12,000 in 3 weeks. People donated because they believed in what she was doing." Jake and Rosa exchanged glances. They'd been so focused on traditional solutions banks, loans, Investors that they hadn't even considered asking for help from the community of people who'd come to care about Clearwater Springs. But those people had social media followings. Rosa said, "We're just a family living in a ghost town." "No, we're not," Aina said, getting more excited as she spoke. "We're a story. Think about it, Mom. You're a widow who turned an abandoned town into a home for your children. Jake, you're a guy who bought a town for $70 and found a family. People love stories like that. And we've got all those visitors who've been coming for tours. They're already invested in what we're doing here." Carlos looked up from his radio project. "Na's right. Remember that couple from last month who asked if they could get married here? And that family who wanted to bring their grandfather back because he used to live here in the 1950s? People care about this place." Jake felt a spark of hope for the first time since the inspection. What would we need to do? Aina had clearly been thinking about this for a while. We'd need to make a video explaining our situation and what we're trying to save. We'd need to show people around the town, tell them about the history and what we've accomplished. And we'd need to offer rewards for different donation levels? Rewards? Rosa asked. Like, if someone donates $25, they get a hand-painted postcard of the town that I make. If they donate $100, they get to stay overnight in one of the guest rooms. If they donate $500, they get a private tour and dinner with our family. Jake was amazed by how thoroughly Anna had thought this through. You really think people would donate money to help us? I think people want to be part of something real, Aina said. Everything these days is corporate and fake. What we have here is authentic. It's a real family working together to save a piece of history. That's exactly the kind of thing people want to support. Rosa was already pulling up crowdfunding websites on her laptop. How long do these campaigns usually run? 30 to 60 days, Aina said, which gives us just enough time if we start right away. They spent the next week preparing for the campaign with an intensity that reminded Jake of their early days restoring the buildings. Anna wrote the story of their town, crafting it in a way that was honest about their struggles while highlighting the hope and community they'd built. Carlos helped Jake film a video tour of Clearwater Springs, showing the before and after of their restoration work. Rosa researched the technical aspects of running a crowdfunding campaign and set up all the necessary accounts. Lucia contributed by organizing their photo collection, finding the best pictures that showed their progress. Over the months, she also insisted on being in the video, introducing viewers to her pet rabbit and showing off the vegetable garden that had become her special project. When they finally launched the campaign, Jake felt like they were jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. They'd set a goal of $18,000, which would cover the required repairs plus the campaign fees. It seemed impossible, but Aina had convinced them to aim high. The first donation came in within an hour of launching. $25 from Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who'd been their first official visitor. Her note said simply, "This place needs to be preserved for future generations." By the end of the first day, they had raised almost $800 from people they'd never met. The campaign had been shared on social media by visitors who'd toured the town, and their story was starting to spread beyond their immediate community. On the third day, something incredible happened. A travel blogger with a large following had discovered their campaign and written about it on her website. The headline read, "A family saved a ghost town, now we can help save them." And suddenly donations were pouring in from all over the country. People weren't just giving money, they were sharing their own stories. A man from Texas donated $100 and wrote about how his grandmother had grown up in a similar mining town. A family from Oregon contributed $50 and said they were planning a road trip to visit Clearwater Springs specifically because of the campaign. A retired teacher from Maine sent $25 and offered to donate books for Aina's informal school program. Jake found himself checking the campaign page obsessively, watching the numbers climb steadily higher. But more than the money, he was amazed by the messages of support. People understood what they were trying to do, and they wanted to be part of it. 2 weeks into the campaign, they received an unexpected visitor. Nicole had driven out from California, just as she'd promised. But the conversation didn't go at all the way Jake had expected. "I saw your crowdfunding campaign," she said without preamble. $18,000, that's it? "Jake, I could write you a check for 10 times that amount right now." "It's not about the money," Jake said, and he realized as he said it that it was completely true. "Of course it's about the money," Nicole laughed. "Everything's about money in the end." "No, it's not," Rosa said, appearing from the general store where she'd been working. "It's about community. It's about people choosing to support something they believe in. Every person who donated to our campaign is now part of Clearwater Springs, in a way that matters more than money." Nicole looked around the town with obvious skepticism. "You really think this little operation is better than what I could build here?" "For us it is," Jake said. "We're not trying to build an empire, Nicole. We're trying to build a home." Nicole shook her head and left without another word, but Jake felt lighter than he had in weeks. Seeing her again had reminded him of exactly why their partnership with Rosa's family was so special. By the end of the 30-day campaign, they had raised over $22,000. More importantly, they had built a community of supporters who were genuinely invested in their success. Some of the donors had already booked visits for the summer, and several had offered to volunteer their professional skills to help with future projects. The money allowed them to hire licensed contractors for all the required repairs, and they even had enough left over to start working on some improvements they'd been dreaming about. But the real victory was the sense that Clearwater Springs had become something bigger than just their family project. 6 months later, Jake stood in that same church, but this time he was wearing a suit and Rosa was wearing a white dress she'd found in a vintage shop in town. The ceremony was small, just Rosa's children, a few close friends who'd become part of their extended community, and some of the supporters from their crowdfunding campaign, who traveled from across the country to be there. Anna had decorated the church with wildflowers from the mountains, and Carlos had gotten the old organ working well enough to play wedding music. Lucia was the flower girl, and she took her job very seriously, making sure every petal was scattered in exactly the right place. As Jake and Rosa exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to continue building their life together in the town that had brought them together, Jake thought about how far they'd all come. A year ago, he'd been a lonely construction worker with no real direction. Rosa had been a struggling widow trying to provide for her children with no permanent home. Now they were partners in every sense of the word, running a small but thriving business that brought joy to visitors and provided a stable, loving home for the children. Clearwater Springs was alive again, not as a museum or a tourist trap, but as a real community where real people lived and worked and dreamed together. After the ceremony, as they celebrated with their friends in the restored saloon, Jake realized that buying a ghost town for $70 had been the best investment he'd ever made. Not because of any financial return, but because it had led him to the family he'd never known he was looking for. Rosa found him standing outside, looking up at the stars that were visible in a way they never were in the city. "Any regrets?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. Jake looked back at the warm light spilling out of the saloon windows, listened to the sound of laughter and music coming from inside, and thought about the children who were probably already asleep in the house. They all shared now. "Not a single one," he said, and he meant it completely.